Senator Ludlam.
Thank you, Mr President, and I'd just like to thank Senator Cash for taking up that issue with such passion. I rise to make some remarks about some of the perverse consequences that can come into play when governments, and obviously most notably our Australian government, react or overreact to cyber threats, and how these responses, I mean, it makes me edgy whenever the government, this government in particular, adds the word cyber to anything. You tend to have to watch your back when that's occurring. And I don't want to downplay the very real threats of identity theft and misappropriation and phishing attempts on people's accounts and these sorts of things, cyberbullying and the other array of threats that people do face in the online environment. But I'm also aware that we run the risk, and the Australian government is running this risk at the moment, of running these campaigns of hyperventilation and pumping up threat and fear as though this is where we are meant to transfer our fear of terrorists, that the internet is the new domain of terror, and the best way to protect ourselves is to submit to perpetual ongoing online surveillance by government, policing and other agencies. I want to dedicate this contribution tonight to a remarkable young man who, unfortunately, I was never able to meet, called Aaron Swartz, who took his own life at the age of 27, while facing potentially more than 30 years in federal prisons in the United States for downloading academic articles. His parents and many of his friends and colleagues have stated that the charges, extraordinary charges that he faced under United States copyright law, and the aggressive way in which those charges were pursued and those prosecutions were pursued, contributed to his death, an extraordinary loss for his family and those who knew him, but also for those of us who didn't know him in the wider community, who were nonetheless better off for his life's work. Aaron Swartz was an innovator. He helped create the RSS feed tool that many of us would use every day, whether we even know it or not. He also created Reddit, and he was quite an important part of the campaign to defeat the dangerous Stop Online Piracy Act, SOPA, that senators may recall reached a fever pitch some time ago. It may explain his involvement in these campaigns and his cheerful but relentless advocacy for the things that he believed in, may explain why he was pursued so vindictively and aggressively. It may be his support for these campaigns, it may be for the changes in attitudes that he's brought to bear on notions of theft and property online. It may be because he was a friend and supporter of Australian citizen Julian Assange. In this tragic case, we see an outdated copyright legal regime in the United States that has long ceased being fit for purpose, that is presently criminalising a whole generation of internet users, and the particular way in which his case was prosecuted when so many others lapse and are left alone tells us something about the state of mind of certain elements of the current US administration and copyright industry overall. What Aaron understood, and what many other young people understand, is that the internet is the greatest information sharing tool in history, and it is potentially peace-building, it is potentially solutions-generating, it is leading, in my view, to the formation of a global civil society, and that is extraordinarily valuable. The question is, of course, whether its potential will be realised or whether it will instead be transformed into the greatest surveillance tool ever created, a kind of global electronic panopticon that some elements in our government seem to be quite keen to try and realise. Of course, when Gutenberg invented the printing press, it was actually banned for periods of time in some parts of Germany. When libraries were created, the publishing industry at the time cried that if people could read for free, authors would starve and the book business would die. And of course, this is an interesting metaphor, because libraries that share culture on a come-one, come-all basis create incentives for further learning and further writing and the creation of more culture. And the internet, among many other things, is the greatest library in human history. The Greens believe that the potentials and the benefits and the gifts of this enormous library and communications tool can be available safely with privacy and human rights and civil liberties intact, but only if we pay very careful attention to the balance that is being struck between these freedoms and our obligations as citizens. We're not getting that balance right at the moment, far from it. We're on the path, actually, to getting it very wrong indeed, by eroding not just the potential of the internet, but of democracy itself through proposals like that of data retention and some of the other proposals that have been forward through the government's national security inquiry. I note that the political fix seems to be in, and I think it's unlikely that the government will bring these proposals forward in an election year, knowing how deeply unpopular they are. But that is simply something short-term, and I fear that these issues will simply be exhumed post-election, and an attempt will be made to put these words in the mouth of our new Attorney-General, who I hope is smarter than that, and I believe he probably is. And I hope we can see some change of tone and tenor around the way that we deal with the threats that exist online. The inventor of the internet, Tim Berners-Lee, or the World Wide Web, I should say, the inventor of the protocol that underpins so much of the information sharing that has become ubiquitous for us today, Tim Berners-Lee was here in Australia recently, and he said that the data retention proposal was, and I quote, fraught with massive danger. He says the information is so dangerous you have to think about it as dynamite, and if it gets away, what you've done is prepare a dossier on every person in the country that will allow them, if that dossier is stolen, to be blackmailed, and he thought the proposal should be buried. One of the gallery journalists who I've got quite a bit of time for, Bernard Keane, who's one of Australia's sharpest minds on this particular subject and the author of an e-book called The War on the Internet, has noted that what we're seeing in this case is a really relaxed approach to government and corporate surveillance of Australian citizens, but exemplary punishment of whistleblowers and online activists. We've tried to get the Australian Federal Police interested in the colossal breach of privacy that appeared to have occurred when Telstra was sending people's data overseas to servers in the United States, potentially exposing Australian communications traffic to the Patriot Act in the US. Can't get them interested in that. But we see these sort of exemplary punishment for people doing whistleblowing and information sharing strongly in the public interest. Bradley Manning is obviously somebody who comes to mind. He's no longer in the horrific hole in the ground where the United States authorities had him for many, many months, but he is nonetheless incarcerated, awaiting this grinding process of court-martial to run its course, as is the gentleman Jeremy Hammond, who may be somewhat less familiar to senators here tonight, who's facing life in prison for allegations that he hacked Stratfor, that sort of private clone of the CIA, for exposing what that organisation was doing in spying on civil society groups, including running strategies against Australian citizen Julian Assange. I thank the Ecuadorian ambassador in London. I was there with some of the staff of WikiLeaks, with Mr Assange and the ambassador on Christmas night, because to the eternal shame of the Australian government, he is without the protection and assistance from the state in which he is a citizen, to quote the words of the Ecuadorian decision to grant him asylum. There are obviously many glimmers of hope, but I also think we need to take a very clear-eyed look at the way that governments are pursuing the radical democratisation of communications that is occurring under the internet, seeing it as a threat and appending the word cyber and terror to many of the things that I believe we should step back and take a good look at before we simply clamp down on them and impose blanket real-time surveillance on all Australian citizens in an attempt to maintain some semblance of control over the medium. There are, of course, many glimmers of hope. The Gov 2.0 task force, ideas championed by Senator Kate Lundy, things that the ACT government have brought forward here in the ACT, give some reasons for hope, and they're obviously small and very local examples. They come from the same ethic as that pursued by Aaron Swartz, that information and data sharing, all else being equal, should be maximised. Certainly, data, if it's being created by government at taxpayers' expense, should be in the public domain. And that includes things that are routinely denied to senators and members of the general public under our broken freedom of information regime. The Greens took the lead in the case of the ACT, but would like to see that go further. I would just like to dedicate this contribution to Aaron Swartz.
Time has expired.
Thank you, President.
Senator Cross.